Door, check. Apparatus, check. What's missing? Oh, hello there. Sorry, I was pretty engrossed in my work. Didn't hear you drop in. How are things? Working hard, I presume? Yeah, me as well, though not necessarily on my quota. More so on this weird old drill. Ever since this door has started doing this, I really just can't get this thing out of my mind. Why is it here? What do we need to do to complete it? It's all pretty exciting to think about, so I've been down here quite a lot, just taking it all in. Actually, come to think of it, I'm pretty sure this is the first time I've ever seen another employee down here besides myself. What's up with that? How'd you find this place? Wait, you're not gonna rat me out, right? I'm not doing anything, I swear, I'm just curious, you know? No, I don't know anything about that mark on the wall or the tracks on the ground that clearly set this thing up to be rammed into the side of the company building. I mean, I don't even know what this is. Oh wait, I already told you it was a drill. Okay, but you gotta believe me, this is history in the making. Somebody's got to document it, right? Oh geez. Okay, well, I'll tell you what. If you made it all the way down here, you and I can't be so different. Face it, you like exploring as much as I do, even if it's in places that we probably ought to keep our noses out of, right? Well, it just so happens that over the course of my many hours of working for the company, I've come to know about a number of such places. Places where the very fabric of the world begins to break down. Places that lie out of bounds. Out of bounds content is one of those things that I think intrigues pretty much everyone interested in video games on some level. There's just something about the sight of an inaccessible area on the horizon that's undeniably awe-inspiring and seems to awaken that latent sense of adventure that we all have in a way that's simply incomparable to many other aspects of gaming. And although I may not show it on this channel very often, exploring out-of-bounds content is one of my favorite game-related hobbies, right up there with researching lore. It's odd, the two are such separate interests in so many ways. I mean, by definition, we can't consider anything out of bounds to be canon content, and yet lore and boundary breaking have always felt like they go together for some reason. Perhaps because, even in their own way, out-of-bounds discoveries do actually contain hints of story. Not necessarily the story of the game, but more so the story behind its creation. And I believe that's especially true in the case of Lethal Company. So today, why don't we take a journey together through some of the most odd and interesting out-of-bounds finds that exist in the game. Just don't tell the boss, alright? From unfinished areas to misplaced models to Easter eggs hidden at the end of the world, these are the out-of-bounds discoveries that exist in the unseen regions of Lethal Company. The first frontier of most employees, Experimentation is a favorite moon of many. Though it may not have the most impressive loot, and the enemies to be found here are generally pretty easily overcome, it's here that many crew members first learned the ropes, and not to mention, being the default destination chosen by the ship at the start of each game, it's no wonder why so many look at these industrial wastes with such fondness. Just as Experimentation is the first world that most players are likely to visit though, behind the scenes it's also one of the first moons developed by Zeekers himself, and so true to its name, there are a lot of characteristics of this place that prove somewhat odd and experimental when contrasted with later worlds. For one thing, Experimentation doesn't make much of an effort to hide the vast empty plain that exists beyond the play area. This is a facet of each and every moon in the game, aside from perhaps the company building, and while most other moons would go on to employ jutting mountain ranges and other such obstacles to obscure the great beyond from view, Experimentation's world boundary is instead blocked off by a simple chain link fence, beyond which are a series of mud pits similar to those that may dot the surface during a rainstorm, though these can be found at any time, regardless of the weather. While a clever idea, these measures have proven easy to overcome, allowing players to get out of bounds with no equipment in some cases, and very likely as a result, it would never see a full-fledged use again on any other future moons. But the boundary isn't the only prototypical area Experimentation has to offer, and interestingly enough, the biggest attraction in this regard doesn't require us to cross any barriers at all. Many of you may know that the Experimentation facility hides an odd and unique secret, one that betrays not only its own development history, but also that of Lethal Company as a whole. Those who have spent time poking around near the fire escape may notice a small, innocuous little opening that can be seen from the outside. But what can't be seen as easily is the massive, partially developed complex that lies within. Composed of weaving hallways, odd interconnected rooms, and perhaps most strangely of all, a vast chamber sporting a number of divots that protrude into the earth, this unseen and unused interior sits comfortably just inside of the facility itself. And ever since Lethal Company's initial release, it's remained perfectly accessible to any employees through the use of just 2 carefully placed extension ladders. Getting inside is very simple. First, line yourself up with the opening from the bottom of the alleyway. It can be difficult to spot the window down here without a light source, so make sure to bring a flashlight along, and once in position, place the first extension ladder about 1 pace from the facility wall. If done correctly, the top of the ladder should come just short of a small ledge built into the side of the building, and while standing on top of the first ladder, you'll be in the perfect position to drop the next onto the small extrusion, where it's a simple climb to the hidden entrance of what is undoubtedly one of the most unique out-of-bounds finds in the entire game. Once inside, you'll pass through a series of empty, interconnected rooms before making your way to the main chamber, a grand and spacious area with several strange indentations made in the ground. The purpose these holes are meant to serve is unclear, and made all the more unnerving by the low, disembodied hum of machinery that emanates through the area, in spite of the fact that no such machinery actually exists. Although the placement of the doorway makes it seem like we're in for a long drop to the ground below, there's actually an invisible platform and stairwell here that, after some trial and error, will make the descent a lot easier. It can be a bit difficult to navigate on account of us being, well, unable to see it, but once on the ground we can marvel further at the strange pits that adorn the center of the room and take one of 2 separate exits, both leading to yet another set of hallways with empty rooms, and at the end of it all, what else but the front door of the facility itself. That's right, all of this unused material sits just beyond the main entrance, allowing us a much-needed reprieve from the darkness of these desolate chambers. Interacting with the door from this side is still possible, and doing so will take us to the inside of the real, instanced version of the facility we're accustomed to, which, in case you're wondering, actually sits beneath the map, with the door merely acting as a sort of teleporter in and out of the procedurally generated zone. Leaving the area will then place us squarely outside the main entrance as if nothing ever happened. But this hidden interior is very real, and its existence actually tells us quite a lot about Lethal Company's early development. Based on what we've seen here, it's easy to infer that at some point during development, interior areas were presumably envisioned to work very differently. It may have been that in the initial vision for the game, each moon would have had its own static facility similar to this one, with some procedural elements such as items and monsters mixed in. But evidently, sometime early on, Zeekers opted to take the game in a different direction, and today, the unused interior on Experimentation is the only evidence that this initial design scheme ever existed in the first place. That being said, combined with some of the other buildings and structures found on this moon though, it does make Experimentation the perfect spot for employees with a penchant for urban exploration. Though it is largely empty, Experimentation's abandoned interior is easily one of the most memorable and significant out-of-bounds discoveries the game has to offer. But for now, let's move on to another rather unique find, one that isn't relegated to just one moon, but 2. Accompanying Experimentation in the Big Grin star system, Assurance and Offense are 2 moons known for being notoriously similar. Just like Experimentation, both worlds feature desert terrain, are overlooked by a bright red sun, and share very similar topography. Largely characterized by steep mountainous environs and deep valleys, Assurance in particular makes us feel as if we've touched down within some sort of canyon, though we already know that this is merely an illusion. The sheer height of the surrounding cliff faces do at least reflect the fact that some effort has been paid to hiding the edge of the map from view, though it isn't perfect, and during the dropship landing sequence in particular, players will be able to catch a pretty significant glimpse of the emptiness beyond. ground. But once on the ground, there's also a specific area where the boundary-defining ledge dips much lower than the surrounding surfaces. As part of the route leading to the fire escape, company employees will need to ascend this ladder, hidden amongst some scaffolding at the base of a giant boulder, and upon reaching the top, navigate across a set of large pipes in order to reach the entrance. But if we decide to take pause atop this overlook, we may very well notice a visible gap in the distant terrain, and within that gap, something unnatural can be seen as well. A ladder, the top of which is just barely visible over the outer wall of the zone. The only way for us to take a closer look is by utilizing a jetpack, but even when we do, the reason for this thing's placement here doesn't become any more readily apparent. The ladder itself is embedded in the ground within a small nook on the far side of the wall, rendering it completely inaccessible through traditional means. And what's more is that, at least at first glance, it doesn't appear to be placed in a position that leads to anywhere in particular. It definitely seems like a misplaced asset, and indeed, it very well may be, but when trying to climb the ladder for ourselves, we'll find that, contrary to appearances, reaching the apex of the ladder actually does carry us back in bounds, which would almost seem to suggest that its inclusion may in fact be intentional. One theory is that perhaps it could have been placed here as a sort of failsafe, allowing any players who manage to find themselves stranded out of bounds to have some method of regaining access. But there are problems with this theory too. If it was intended, we would think that the ladder would be placed more snugly against the cliff. And not only this, but we would expect that the area at the bottom of the ladder would be a lot more cleaned up, since as it stands now, conflicting geometry makes it almost impossible to traverse here. And last but not least, there's also the fact that the same exact ladder also appears on offense. By and large, the sloping mountains that make up Offense's world boundaries are very similar to Assurance, but if an employee decides to take a left when leaving the facility's main entrance and runs all the way to the edge of the map, they'll find a fence that allows for a plain view of the area beyond, and on the rightmost side, you guessed it, the mysterious ladder can be seen again, this time far more removed from any surrounding geometry. Unlike on Assurance, getting out of bounds here is as simple as hopping around the side of the fence, which allows us to once again find that the ladder is fully interactable, but fully useless, devoid of any functional capacity, since this time the top of the ladder actually leads nowhere. But the question remains, are these ladders here intentionally, or are they a mistake? And the answer, at least in my opinion, seems to be a bit more complicated than it may at first seem. In order to understand what seems to be going on here, we have to first understand two things about Lethal Company as a game. First is that unused and misplaced assets are by no means a rarity in this title, and in fact, though they are often not visible without the use of mods, there are actually dozens of examples of assets just like our ladders hidden all over the place. Many of them may have been placed for reference or are simply erroneous holdovers from an earlier phase in development, but there's a strong case to be made that many others still may have actually originated as the result of an entirely different process. Which brings us to our second point, that being that many of Lethal Company's moons were initially created by simply altering aspects of an existing map, and a perfect example of this can be found in the case of Assurance and Offense. From the shared desert theme, the footprint of their central area, and multiple structures shared between the two maps, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Offense was likely built atop a copy of Assurance, and for whatever reason, many of the assets that went unused in the former's design weren't fully deleted, but merely hidden out of bounds. Some certainly better than others. So could it be that the ladder on Assurance really was placed intentionally, but when the moon was copied to create Offense, it was merely cast aside, no longer equipped to serve its original purpose? In all likelihood, we'll probably never know the full story behind this pair of objects. Our next discovery is a bit different from the ones we've discussed so far. Not only does it bring us to our first non-desert moon, but it's also the first and perhaps the only find in this entire video that actually seems to have some significance, no matter how small, directly to Lethal Company's lore. In order to see it, we have to visit Vow, the first of the Green Witches, a trio of moons orbiting the planet No Service, known for their heavily forested environments and wealth of plant and animal life. In spite of the flourishing scenery though, there are a number of remote facilities scattered around the system, and cutting through the jungle on Vow, we'll find ourselves in front of one of the largest, sitting on the far side of a gorge that must be crossed in order to gain entry. The most direct path inside is over a rickety bridge, which will bring employees nearly perpendicular with this alleyway, a facet of the environment that most will ignore on their way to the facility door. But for those who take a second to stop and explore this area in any modern version of the game, a very cool secret lies in wait. During the very short window of time when the sun catches this wall found midway through the narrow passage, several pieces of bright purple graffiti can be seen on the side of the building, and although we can see some of it from behind this boundary fence, it's definitely worth bringing a jetpack along in order to get a closer look. Illustrated in bright purple, these simple images are meant to look as if they were created using the spray paint item, a fun piece of utility that can be purchased from the store aboard the ship for 50 credits. And with that said, you wouldn't be remiss for thinking that's pretty much the extent of their inclusion here, just a neat hidden detail to reference an in-game item. But as I imagine some of you may have already figured out, there's actually a bit more to the story behind these. A story that dates all the way back to version 45. You see, version 45, which is only the second content update that Lethal Company ever received, is one of just 4 versions whose launch would be accompanied by an announcement trailer uploaded to Zeeker's YouTube channel. It's actually the first time that a new version received a dedicated trailer like this, and in the beginning, we can see a crew member creating the very same artwork just to the left of the Vow facility entrance, of course using the spray paint, which was a new feature at the time. So the artwork being enshrined on the map in this way not only calls back to an important update in Lethal Company's history, but it also suggests that this small one-off clip included in the trailer might actually be canon material, even if the location of the graffiti may have been slightly altered from the original video. But finally, one of the other things that I particularly love about Vow's graffiti is that it's actually an Easter egg in more ways than one. One of the depictions portrayed on the mural is a small quadrupedal animal that, to the uninitiated, might look like some kind of crudely drawn dog or horse. But in reality, this is a reference to the character Shrimp from one of Zeeker's other games, The Upturned. And with this in mind, I think it only serves to make this discovery even more interesting. But Vow's graffiti is only out of bounds in the most technical sense of the word. Sure, it's placed beyond a boundary fence, but it's still almost fully visible from the normal bounds of the map. Though on the other forest moons, March and Adamance, things definitely get a bit more complicated. There can be no doubt that the world of Adamance is one of my favorite moons in the entire game, especially after the recent version 70 rework. Not only does it have one of the most unique atmospheres in the entirety of Lethal Company, especially now, but it's also a map that has long been perfectly suited for outdoor exploration. There are a number of interesting inbounds areas here that, under normal circumstances, most employees will probably never visit. And by far my favorite of these is this small, secluded peninsula that overlooks the water just behind the dropship area. It's strangely peaceful in spite of itself, and also just so happens to be one of the easiest areas on the map to break out of bounds without any additional tools. Doing so, we can take a look at all kinds of material that we were never meant to see, at least not up close, including this freestanding tower to the right of the facility, which can be seen all the way from the ship, and nearby, this deep hole, which is totally invisible from within bounds and definitely makes for a perplexing sight. But there's actually another interesting find unique to Adamance that can be seen even further out of bounds, as when approaching the series of foothills that lie on the outer edge of every forest moon, employees will find that there's a stark color disparity between the hills themselves and the rest of Adamance's terrain, a phenomenon that, once again, has its roots in the process behind this map's creation. We've already discussed how moons like Offense may have been created as a direct copy of an already existing moon, but the unique topography and color palette on Adamance seem to have necessitated the use of a slightly different process, wherein an elevated horizontal plane was overlaid across the map's entire central area. This plane was placed some height above the underlying base map, which then allowed for many of the deeper areas of topography to be carved and extruded out without having to remake the base plane. It's probably because of this process that the crater at the moon's center is able to exist at all, and it allowed Zeekers to more easily implement a unique texture for the moon's surface. But elements such as these foothills were still large enough to poke through, being a part of the underlying map and not the additional top layer. This explains the disparity in color, and while atmospheric effects may hide this from a distance, it's much more obvious once we get up close and personal. This is only really one half of what makes these foothills so interesting though, for if we continue over them and into the no man's land beyond, then it actually won't be long before we reach the edge of the overlay entirely, which is quite the sight to behold both above and below. Seeing this firsthand really gives us a sense of scale as to just how displaced Adamance's topography really needed to be in order to accommodate for the moon's layout. Because planes are only visible and have collision in a single direction in Lethal Company, making our way underneath it will reveal that it's completely invisible from the underside, but still casts a long, ominous shadow that extends all the way to the base of the hills from which it protrudes, making it quite the odd spectacle. Up to this point, this boundary is the furthest out-of-bounds anomaly we've seen anywhere in the game, and it's certainly a bit surreal to see firsthand. The fact that all of this was left exposed is somewhat baffling, even if it is a considerable distance from the main area. But on our last forest moon, March, there's actually another little-known discovery that requires us to travel even further into the unknown. Unlike the other two forest moons, there actually aren't very many out-of-bounds oddities in the immediate vicinity of the March map. But in spite of the unassuming nature of the play area, this world does host an intriguing little secret very far out of bounds. Accessing this discovery without the use of mods is nearly impossible, but not necessarily for the reasons you might expect. To get to it, we have to traverse a considerable distance out of bounds, traveling much deeper than we've ever gone before into the turbulent plains that exist beyond the map. And let me tell you, this is without a doubt the most difficult challenge we've had to endure thus far. There are no hazards or boundaries that await us in these rolling pastures, but the sheer vastness of them makes them nearly impossible to cross through conventional means before the clock strikes midnight and the ship leaves us behind. Since reaching our destination on foot is prohibitively time-consuming, we have to resort to a strange, risky, and costly setup, filling our inventory with multiple jetpacks and chaining them together to travel as far as we can out of bounds as quickly as possible. This isn't a foolproof method, however, as the sheer amount of flying we're doing makes it very likely that a pack will explode mid-air, ending our journey prematurely. And even if executed perfectly, there's still a considerable amount of walking that will have to be done in order to reach our goal. This far out, the sheer scale of the surrounding environs really begin to sink in. Bearing witness to the hills and slopes that adorn the countryside is a very different experience on the ground than it is from the air. In our cinematic or free-cam view, it's easy to lose track of the sheer size of the surrounding mountains. But make no mistake, these landmasses are positively gargantuan, easily dwarfing any employees who venture this far from their objective. Eventually though, if we've gone in the right direction, we'll find ourselves in front of a slope that looks like this. And after making the slow but steady ascent to the top, we'll have finally reached what is, without a doubt, one of the strangest Easter eggs in this entire game. Standing at about waist height, an odd array of static models can be seen arranged in a ring-like formation. Their bodies consist of slightly slanted cylinders, colored in cream white, with large eyes and noses adorning the face of each one. Now, I'm betting that while some of you may be understandably confused as to what this is and what it's doing out here, a good number of those who are just as obsessed with this game as I am have likely already identified these things right away, because these strange little creatures aren't just random models, but are in fact something we see elsewhere in the game. They're the mascot of the in-game brand Teliot's paper rolls, which is of course the brand present on the toilet paper scrap item. As for why these recreations of the mascot exist all the way out here on March though, well, that part's a little bit less clear. Is it merely an Easter egg, or is there some deeper reason for this being here? And the way I see it, there's really only one practical explanation to explain why Teliot may have found himself all the way out here. Personally, I have a feeling that these may have been used as reference models for rendering the picture present on the toilet paper label itself. And although that might seem odd or nonsensical at first, there is actually something that I think is pretty solid evidence toward this conclusion. One of the things that I immediately found odd about these toilet paper rolls is how, contrary to what we see in the picture, there is no hole in the top of the cylinder. It really does just look like a solid mass. But if we examine the toilet paper scrap item picture more closely, we'll see that the top of the character isn't visible at all, but there is a hole on the bottom. And sure enough, using FreeCam to clip below the geometry, we can see that these models actually do have a hole extruded through their bottom center. It just doesn't go all the way through the model, so it's completely invisible from the top. As a result, I imagine it's not out of the question that Zeekers may have laid these out here in order to experiment with different angles and use the authentic light engine of the game in order to capture their likeness for the image. But something tells me that it's probably also not a coincidence that these were just left here. I'd like to think that even if these models were originally placed out here to fulfill this purpose, they may have been left as a highly secluded Easter egg for only the most die-hard fans and explorers of Lethal Company to find. The Teliot Ring is without a doubt one of the most bizarre and delightful discoveries in the game, and being a relatively nominal distance from the very edge of the world, it's also, without a doubt, the most far-flung point of interest that Lethal Company is ever likely to see. Next, it's time to move on to a new set of worlds, namely the Ice Moons, which I'm sad to say, for the most part, are actually pretty much devoid of any crazy or bizarre finds, especially when contrasted with all of the interesting points of interest on the Forest Moons. The only thing of any particular note across both Rend and Dine are more floating pieces of set design below the map, and in the case of Rend, a concrete wall or walkway similar to the one observed on Vow, sitting rather unassumingly just out of sight. It's somewhat debatable whether this could even be considered out of bounds in the first place, which only adds to the point that where these two moons are concerned, there's a lot more generally interesting areas than there are actual anomalies. But the same cannot be said of the moon Titan, once the final destination of most teams of employees in the early days of the game, and sometimes considered a sort of unofficial ice moon in its own right. Once a prosperous site for mining in the lore, the majority of Titan's surface is overshadowed by a massive concrete facility, not dissimilar to the company building on 71 Gordian. It's certainly a favorite of many players, both for its endgame potential and the unique vertical dynamic of its exterior, but any employees daring or distracted enough to explore the other side of the Titan building are certainly in for a surprise. In a lot of ways, Titan is sort of a step backwards in design philosophy from a lot of the other worlds we've seen throughout this video. Just like on Experimentation, Zeekers would more or less embrace the great empty beyond of this moon, and certainly would not try to hide its presence as well as he did on other worlds. This leads to a very loosely defined play area, so to get around the Titan facility, we're left with two options. Either we can travel to the edge of the building on either side, which will constitute a considerable amount of travel and waste of valuable time, all while attempting to maintain a steady course through the moon's thick, unnerving fog, or we can bypass all of these tribulations and simply fly over it using a jetpack. The building extends so high that it actually exceeds the upper limit of the fog effect present on the ground, making our line of sight unnervingly clear as we ascend to the roof and make the trek to the far side of the building. When dropping down, we can pretty easily use the jetpack again to slow our descent, and just like that, we've reached the far side of the moon, a side that, we'll very quickly see, was definitely never meant to be seen. For if we're to turn to the right and proceed forward while hugging the wall of the massive building, it won't be long before we come across this. A bright white square with 3 idle employee player models hanging mid-air above it. A very weird find to be sure, but unlike any of the other discoveries in this video, this isn't just some obtuse Easter egg or odd leftover from the game's map design. No. What if I told you that what we've just come across is actually a highly important piece of Lethal Company's internal programming, a bit of exposed wiring, so to speak, that is incredibly rare to see through conventional means. In fact, the exact same model exists somewhere within every single stage in the game, including both the company building and the darkness of space that exists between stages if our ship isn't docked at a given moon. Most of the time though, this platform is hidden underground, or so far away as to make it impossible to find, but Titan is a rare exception. The nature of this thing is first hinted at by those employees whose bodies are overlapping above the platform. We'll notice that there are a total of 3, one for each additional player we can have in a lobby before reaching the maximum capacity of 4 allowed by the game in an unmodded state. What's interesting though is that if I were to come back here with a friend, we'll see there are only 2 bodies present, meaning that strange as it may seem, this is a staging area. A place where additional employees' bodies are stored, awaiting a player to take control of them. Once a new player is added to the game, one of these models is simply teleported from here to the main area, and that's really all there is to it. Platforms like this one are a fundamental part of the back end of the multiplayer systems that exist in Lethal Company, and it's incredibly interesting to find one all the way out here behind the Titan building, a back-end system on the back end of one of the game's most infamous stages. And so we arrive at the last point in today's expedition, a discovery that brings us to the moon of Embrion. And I have to admit, when I first surveyed this moon in the process of finding discoveries for this video, I really didn't expect to find much of note here. As mentioned earlier, Embrion joins Adamance and Artifice as the only moons ever added to Lethal Company after release. And as a result, especially in the case of these latter 2 moons, they're generally considered fairly clean of unused assets and many of the other more prototypical oddities we've become accustomed to, but as first evidenced by the haphazard placement of the Great Plain that exists on Adamance, what these moons lack in traditional oddities, they more than make up for in uncharacteristically shoddy geometry. Artifice is undoubtedly the cleanest of the new moons in this regard, with a small floating platform southwest of the play area being the only find of note. But on Embrion, there's another geometric flaw that, though small, has some very interesting ramifications. Pretty much due north of the dropship, owing to the flat, nearly featureless terrain of the moon's surface, there's an area where it's possible for employees to walk straight out of bounds. Of course, there's not much out here that we haven't already seen before, just flat terrain and a generally open view. So it's only when turning back to face the play area again that something looks a bit odd. Unlike other areas on the surface, there's a distinctly jagged edge to this particular foothill, and upon closer inspection, it's revealed that for whatever reason, this particular hill was never completely finished. And although this would never be obvious from inbounds, the resulting hole is large enough for players to enter, thus giving us complete and total access to the underside of the Embrion map. The view from down here is a little awkward, but it's also kind of magical. Even as the dangerous old birds awaken from their mechanized slumber on the surface, they're simply unable to detect us through the earth, and will instead simply mull about aimlessly, making them perfectly safe to observe here, as if the whole moon has just become some kind of overhead wildlife exhibit. It's not a particularly comfortable place to be. Some portions are cramped or inaccessible due to the dips in the above terrain, and getting too close to the underside of the normal ground plane will force us back in bounds, once again causing us to draw the ire of the beasts on the surface, but it is, in a very literal sense, a side of the game that we almost never get to see. And really, I think that's what makes all of this stuff so intriguing and beautiful. So, what do you think? What a journey we've been on, right? Now listen, truth be told, the stuff I've shown you today is only a small taste of the type of world that exists out of bounds. There are plenty of other sites to see, large and small, and undoubtedly some that haven't even been discovered yet. Either way though, I hope you found some of this as interesting as I have. Maybe some of you will even be compelled to explore the unknown for yourselves. And if you find anything out there, be sure to let me know. So what do you think? Are we square? I showed you what I know, so I'm counting on you not to say anything about this here drill, alright? Yes indeed, one day this thing's gonna be real important. And I mean, what's more out of bounds than inside the company building itself, am I right? I don't know about you, but I can't wait to see how it all shakes out. And you already know that when that day comes, I'll be here to cover it. But, as I hope we've both come to understand over the course of this past half hour, until that time comes, there's still more than enough to explore. This is Everberon. I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.